Hello and welcome to the Carroll School webinars. I'm Andy Boynton. I'm the Dean of the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. You may be familiar with our in-person finance conference, which brings together industry leaders and academic researchers as well as policymakers each year, typically on campus in Chestnut Hill. But this year we've widened the reach of those discussions with a new series of stimulating webinars, collectively called Navigating Financial Turbulence in Challenging Times. And in doing so, we've created a valuable outlet for specialists and non-specialists alike to discuss urgent topics relevant to the moment we're in. I'm sure you're going to find it interesting. Today, you're joining the second of those conversations, examining the current state of retirement savings and other issues related to retirement that we all face. Leading experts in the field will share insights culled from decades of retirement research and planning. We have a first-class and a world-class panel for you today. Moderating the conversation is Jonathan Reuter, an associate professor of finance at the Carroll School. John is as sharp a scholar as he is a poker player. I know that firsthand. And John's written extensively about retirement plan design and participant behavior in some of the top finance journals in the world. In 2013, John won the TIAA-CREF Paul A. Samuelson Award for outstanding scholarly writing on lifelong financial security. And John continues to raise the stakes at Boston College. In addition to being a great scholar, he's a tremendous teacher. Thank you for all engaging in this important and insightful conversation today. I hope you'll join us again this Friday for a final session about financial global markets. And you can learn more about that event as well as access the full recordings of our first webinar, which happened on Monday. Just go to our website, bc.edu/CSOM, CSOM. Enjoy the webinar.
All right, well, thank you and welcome to Boston College CSOM webinar on navigating retirement savings. Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. I think it's fair to say that you greatly overstated my abilities as a poker player, but we're right on about this being a world-class panel of experts. This is kind of bittersweet, right? On the one hand, I deeply wish that we were able to hold this conference in person as we have in years past. This is supposed to be the 15th annual conference. On the other hand, webinar is kind of the new normal, and this is an opportunity to reach a much wider audience than we have been able to reach in the past. So, with that said, I think that we should dive in. There's plenty of material to cover here, and we've got these excellent panelists to help us do so. So, I have introductions for the panelists. We should have 3 on, 2 at the moment, and 3rd coming soon, I hope. My introductions will only begin to describe their collective expertise. So let's get into the bios. We have Ed, perfect. All right, so I'm going to read these bios because they're too long for me to have possibly memorized. So I want to start with Bob Reynolds. Bob Reynolds is President and Chief Executive Officer of Putnam Investments, leading global asset management firm, and chair of Great West Life and Annuity Insurance Company, a provider of retirement savings products and services. Bob is widely regarded as a driving force of innovation and progress in institutional and retail financial services. He spent 20 years or more at Fidelity, helping it become a market leader in retirement savings before moving to Putnam in 2008. He's received numerous industry awards, and in particular, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Plan Sponsor Magazine, popularizing employer-sponsored 401k plans, very much a topic we will be on today. He's also a recipient of Boston College President's Medal of Excellence, and in 2017, he authored From Here to Security, How Workplace Savings Can Keep America's Promise. We will be talking about that book. Alicia Manel is Peter F. Drucker Professor of Management Sciences at Boston College Carroll School of Management, so a colleague of mine, and Director of the Center for Retirement Research. She's a distinguished researcher who has published extensively on topics related to public and private pensions and Social Security. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received numerous other academic awards. Prior to joining Boston College, she served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy and is Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. In 2015, she chaired the U.S. Social Security Advisory Board's Technical Panel on Assumptions and Methods, which is probably as interesting as it sounds. And in 2014, she co-authored Falling Short, The Coming Retirement Crisis and What to Do About It. So we've got 2 experts, 2 books. We'll be talking about them. Last but certainly not least, Ed is President and CEO of Empower Retirement and Great West Life and Annuity Insurance Company. Ed also began his career at Fidelity, later served as Managing Director of the Defined Contribution and Investment-Only business at Putnam. When Empower Retirement was created in 2014, Ed was appointed as the inaugural president. Empower Retirement currently serves more than 9.6 million individuals, 40,000 organizations, managing around $600 billion in assets. Ed is a thought leader for and frequent advocate of the defined contribution system. He holds numerous board positions, including on the Employee Benefit Research Institute in Boston College Wall Street Council. He received his BA, or his bachelor's degree from Boston College, and is a graduate of the General Management Program at Harvard Business School. I had the pleasure of actually meeting Ed last year in person at the finance conference, and this panel came out of those conversations. All right, that was an awful lot, but hopefully you are now convinced that these are experts worthy of your time. I certainly am. All right, so the way we're planning on running this is I'm going to be asking questions of the panelists for 50 to 60 minutes. Then we're going to transition to audience Q&A. However, the best way for the Q&A to work, of course, will be for you to submit questions as you have them so we can get them filtered to me so that when we transition, I'll have plenty of hard-hitting questions for them. I think what we should do, though, is we should start with a high-level assessment of the state of the retirement savings in the U.S. So by way of an incredibly general background, the goal here in a retirement system is to allow people to have the same standard of living when they're working as when they're retired, right? That's kind of the classic economic ideal. It's called consumption smoothing. And for current workers, the US system relies on this combination of Social Security benefits on the one hand, and defined contribution retirement savings in 401k plans and IRAs on the other. If you wanted to distill this down to the simplest possible advice, you would just tell people, start saving early, save more, earn a higher return, and you'll be just fine. That is, of course, all much easier said than done. So with that as the way of background, I think we should open it up to a couple of very general questions. I'm going to start with Alicia. And so, Alicia, what are the main challenges facing workers saving for retirement today?
So, John, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here among such an august group. We know that the system isn't working perfectly because the National Retirement Risk Index, which the center produces, shows that half of today's working households are not going to be able to maintain their standard of living in retirement. Other work that we've done has shown that the main reason for this worrisome outcome is the lack of continuous access to a workplace-based savings vehicle. In the United States, at any given moment in time, half of private sector workers are not participating in an employer-provided plan. And while some pick up coverage along the way, a third are left only with Social Security, and then a bunch with just very modest savings. So going forward, I think that coverage is the main issue. And then for those who are lucky enough to have coverage, I think this new era of low returns is going to be really challenging.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are definitely some themes we're going to be hitting on today. Bob, what is your take on the state of retirement savings in the U.S.?
Well, I think with Social Security being the basis, I think it's a good platform for millions and millions of Americans. I do think there are still defined benefit plans, more on the public fund side than on the private, but those are extremely valuable for people. And then I think the workplace savings, defined contribution, 401k for corporate, the Americans that have that available to them, it has provided a tremendous source of retirement. And you're right. If people start early enough, save as much as they can, obviously, many things through the Pension Protection Act, like target date funds, have provided the right investment vehicles. People are having more than 100% income replacement at retirement if they take advantage of this. And so I do think the system does work for the people who have access. I agree with Alicia that coverage is a huge issue. Slightly more than 1/2 of working Americans have workplace savings available to them. We have to get it to the other half. And there was a recent bill, the Secure Act, that does provide multi-employer plans that I think will be a huge benefit, but providing coverage is going to be the key long-term.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there, and we're gonna be talking about a lot of these things. We'll talk about the Secure Act. We'll talk about target date funds. We'll make sure people know kind of what we're talking about when we say those things. Ed, what is your take on the biggest challenges facing retirement savers these days?
Well, first of all, I would say that if you look at the system today, it's probably one of the most successful public-private partnerships that the country's ever pursued. We've got over 110 million Americans in the system, over 7 trillion in assets. That being said, the work's not done. As Bob and Alicia said, coverage is a major factor, right? You've got millions of Americans that aren't saving. And they typically are only saving if they're saving through workplace savings. And so that's something that we need to tackle as an industry and as a country. So I'd say the coverage issue is the biggest challenge facing us. And then obviously, to your earlier point, John, it's about replacing pre-retirement income and using both private dollars and public dollars like Social Security to help us achieve that. And we've seen really good strides there in terms of people on track to replace their pre-retirement income, but we've got a ways to go.
Okay, thanks. So one of the things I noticed in those intros is, Alicia said about half of people have access to a plan, and framed it as a negative, and Bob said more than half of people have access to a plan and framed it as a positive. So I think access is definitely something that we're going to be talking about. In terms of, if there was one thing that we could change about the system overnight in order to kind of shore it up or make it work for more people, I'm curious if you guys have different opinions about that one thing should be or not. So Ed, if there's one thing that you could change overnight about the system as it is, what would it be? What's the rationale?
Well, again, I mean, I think when public policymakers and regulators in the industry come together, there's a lot that can be accomplished. So I would be bold and I'd be aggressive, and I would mandate that small employers make plans available to their employees. And there's a bill that's pending that does just that and addresses some of the challenges and limitations in setting up a plan that small business owners feel today, namely the cost. That's a factor. The second thing would be the concerns around fiduciary responsibilities that they have. So if you can remove some of those barriers, and then you don't mandate or require small businesses to contribute to the plan, but rather make it available and simplify the setup process for small businesses, we'll go a long way to addressing the coverage gap. And there's a lot of support, bipartisan support, quite honestly, for that type of a proposal.
Okay, so the solution that you're looking for is expanded access through employers. Okay, sounds reasonable. Alicia, what is your take? What is the one thing that if you could change something overnight about this system that you'd be trying to change?
Well, I have to do two, and I'll do one quickly because we're going to come back to it. And that is we need to get Social Security on a sound financial footing. But in terms of the private sector plan, I agree with that we need an employer mandate that says that you have to auto enroll your employees in a retirement plan of some type. And he's absolutely right. That's the only way people save. They don't go out and open IRAs. They need to save through some automated retirement procedure. In that regard, I'm really excited about the experiments at the state level, which is nobody wants 50 different state plans, but Oregon and California and Illinois have set up auto enrollments into IRAs. And we're going to learn a lot in terms of who participates and what makes people take their money out, and whether they're actually, low-income people are actually increasing their savings by doing this, or are they increasing their debt at the same time. And so I have the same goal as Ed, a national system, and I think we're going to have some information which to implement it effectively.
Very good.
John, I just want to add one comment, building off of what Elisa said. We know what works, right? So we know, as Bob referenced earlier, the Pension Protection Act, features like auto enroll, auto escalation, auto re-enroll. We've got the basis for making this successful and addressing the coverage gap. There's plenty of examples out there in the marketplace that defines what success is. And the only way we're going to address it is we've got to force the issue with a mandate. But again, I think if we address the issues that small businesses care about and we remove those barriers, and you don't require or mandate them to make contributions, that should be their own determination based on the success of their business and based on just market factors, frankly. Then I think we go a long way to addressing this shortfall. You're on mute, John.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So I'm trying not to, every time there's a lawn service outside my window, I'm trying not to have you guys listen to that. So Bob, why don't you weigh in, and then I think this will, I have some ideas about where we're going next.
Yeah, I think all of this, what's been discussed by both participants, behavioral economics is the basis for the system working. And as Ed said, the Pension Protection Act, which passed in 2006, made automatic enrollment, automatic escalation, and provided a safe harbor for target date funds, bought 401k, workplace savings in the mainstream. That's when the true replacement, a defined benefit, took place. But one thing that's we'll continue to touch on, and I think is critical, is the Employee Benefit Research Institute did a study about participation, and middle to lower income workers that have access to workplace savings, 80% of them are participating. So just having access brings in a group of people that we definitely want in the retirement system. That same number, if you do not have workplace savings available to you, that number drops below 10% are actually saving for retirement. Now that's not including Social Security, and Social Security is important to many, many millions and millions of workers. But that's why I think everyone on this panel agrees participation, having access is going to be key to having a retirement system that works for everyone.
John, can I just I think this is what Bob means. You need access, but you need auto enrollment too, because you're emphasizing how important the behavioral stuff is.
It does, but just having a plan available work, and we all know that workplace having payroll deduction encourages people to save even more. And then you do automatic on top of it.
Yeah.
It adds to it even further, but payroll deduction is the key. The federal government found this out many years ago when they started withholding taxes. People actually paid on time. So I think payroll deduction is so important.
So I agree payroll deduction is really important, but the difference in participation between auto enrollment and plans without auto enrollment is quite a lot.
Yeah, 65% without it, close to 90% with it. So it does make a significant difference, no question.
Okay, so I think it's probably important that we step back and define a couple terms for people who are less familiar with some of these issues than we are. Pension Protection Act of 2006 did a couple of things in the defined benefit space, but we're talking about the defined contribution space. It essentially endorsed auto enrollment. Auto enrollment existed before the Pension Protection Act, but it effectively endorsed it. It endorsed something called auto escalation, which was the idea that you start saving at a particular rate, and then over time you can slowly raise that rate to hit a target, maybe let's say 10%. And the third thing that it did is that it allowed employers to offer target date funds, Bob, as you said before, as the default investment option. And what's important, there are two things that are important about this. The first is that prior to that, the most common default was a money market, right? So a lot of people who were being automatically enrolled into a retirement plan ended up putting their money into a money market fund at maybe 50%, and then at the end of time, when they went to graduate, or not graduate, sorry, when they went to retire, that's graduation season, but when they went to retire, they thought, wow, I basically just have my contributions and not much more. Target date funds were a huge improvement on that, because target date funds provide asset allocation advice to participants implicitly, in the sense that younger participants have a lot of exposure to equity, and older participants have less exposure to equity. And so what automatic enrollment does is it puts younger participants into higher shares of equity than historically they'd been in. I think that's the positive. Auto enrollment is crucial there. The research that we've all seen and talked about says that auto enrollment can have a huge effect, particularly on young, low-income workers. Right? That's really the place where you see a bump up in savings. Now, those studies have not focused on the sort of low-income workers that we'll be talking about a little bit later when we talk about these state-sponsored plans and trying to expand coverage. But within the world of 401k plans, lower-income workers, younger workers have benefited a lot. So that's kind of the backdrop in terms of what institutional details have come up. And we just got one question, and I'm mostly going to defer Q&A until later, but we just got one question that I think is really important here, which is it better to be having people automatically save for retirement, or would it be better to have them automatically save in a rainy day fund to help deal with the sort of economic uncertainty that we're living through right now?
Well, I think one thing we found out in the 401k system is that by having people allowed to participate with the idea that they could take out a loan from their 401k or take out a hardship, that is never encouraged. But just the fact that people have access to that money, if they ever absolutely needed it, made them contribute more. So it really was a very positive reinforcement on people participating at a higher level. Most people don't use that feature, but I'm a firm believer, in statistics bear it out, that people are contributing more because they know they have access, if they absolutely need it, to either a hardship or, as you're seeing now through the pandemic, where the government allowed people to draw down or just take out a loan.
Yeah, I think they need to do both, John. And I realize that sometimes it's challenging for people to save for retirement and save for a rainy day fund. But we've seen the statistics, and they're pretty disturbing. The fact that more than 40% of Americans don't have access to $400 to take care of an unexpected emergency. That's a problem. But to say that you're not going to save in a tax advantage way is just a big mistake. And I know Alicia has some of the statistics that bear this out. I mean, the fact of the matter is people who start saving at 23, 24, 25, even if it's a de minimis savings rate of 3, 4, 5%, they are much more likely to replace that income in retirement than you are if you start at 35 or 37. So you want to take advantage of the fact that the money goes in pre-tax and it grows on a tax-deferred basis. But at the same time, you should be setting aside some dollars to cover an unexpected emergency or problem that one might have. The other thing, and we won't get into this too much today, but I've got two children that are working now in their 20s, and they're both enrolled in high deductible plans. And the other thing I've encouraged them to do, high deductible healthcare plans, is to take advantage of the health savings accounts, because those are triple tax free, and it's probably the best savings vehicle we have, whether you're young or middle aged. So those are my comments on emergency savings versus IRA.
Just to add one thing, John, you mentioned target dates, and I think target dates have 75% of all flows in 401k now go into target dates. And you mentioned that it took younger workers to invest more aggressively when before target dates were given a safe harbor, young people stayed very conservative and they did default to money market. But however, conversely that, what you had are the older part of the workforce, people nearing retirement, were too aggressively invested. And what a target date does is invest to a retirement date or invest through a retirement date. So I think it's helped everyone along the age spectrum of the appropriate way to invest. I will say it, to me, it is, when I look at target date, it is packaged advice. And it's been extremely, extremely beneficial, again, for millions of working Americans.
All right, Alicia, very good. Alicia, what do you have to say about
So, I mean, of course, people need both emergency saving and saving for retirement. And I think when we're thinking of expanding coverage, and we in tax deferred savings mechanisms, we have to consider whether we want to set it up as a Roth, where you sort of pay your tax first and then you take out your money tax free, or we want to do it in the traditional way where you put in tax pre-tax money and then pay taxes when your money comes out. I think for low income people that to have a Roth is really important, because it means that their long-term goal can be saving for retirement. But if they have a catastrophe, such as we're all having now, they can also tap those accounts for everyday emergencies. And so we need to think of something that solves both problems, addresses both problems when we're dealing with the lower paid worker.
Okay, so there are a lot of things on the table right now. So Alicia, I think one of the things that you may have just not mentioned was that when you pull money out of a Roth, it's penalty free so long as it's the contributions that are coming out, which is an additional layer of safety with respect to kind of dual purpose savings, I suppose.
Right, the earnings on these are a little more complicated, but
right.
Your own contributions you can take out without any penalty, which is, it seems like a sensible way to set up an account for people who might need that money. And yes, you can borrow or have hardships with the typical 401k, but that's a more complicated process.
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things here that we can touch on. And so the first of those, I want to just ask Ed about the extent to which plans have embraced the Pension Protection Act, and so the extent to which they're using auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, and target date funds. So we'll start with Ed there. And then what I want to do is I actually want to circle back and talk about COVID-19 and the current market and what people are doing, in particular with respect to withdrawals. So Ed, why don't we talk about the success, to the extent that you've seen it as a success in the uptake in auto enrollment and what those savings rates happen to be, and then we'll talk about current events.
Sure. Well, I would say the uptake is more prominent in the large mega corporate market. So the bigger institutions typically will adopt all the features: auto enrollment, auto escalation, auto re-enrollment. The most common of all of them is auto enrollment. Auto escalation is a slightly lower percentage. But as you move down market, smaller corporations, typically companies under 1,500 employees, you're more in the 35 to 45% of those companies typically adopting auto enrollment. So I think there's more work to do to drive adoption of those features that were granted as part of the Pension Protection Act. And you know, to your point, and to the point that Bob was making earlier, and Elisa, when those features are enabled and they're part of the plan, you obviously do see higher savings rates. You see higher deferral rates because of the annual increases through auto escalation. So it's something as a company that deals with 40,000 institutions, small, large, mega. We do business with 24 of the 50 states. It's something that we're actively encouraging. So even if the switch is turned on, you still want to continue to encourage individuals to save as much as they can.
So in his book, Bob talks about, I think it calls it the 3% glitch, which is this idea that at least in the early days following the Pension Protection Act, default savings rates were set at 3%. And I remember talking to people in Department of Labor and Treasury, and they said, well, that's because the example in the document that was distributed happened to be 3%. Everyone thought, well, that seems like a good number. We'll use that. Do we have the sense that people have kind of moved above 3%? Because I think that's probably at the employer level, not such a large number.
Yeah, I think they have. I think it's been an education process, but because the government set it at 3%, everyone said, well, if I save 3%, I'm covered. That's not enough. They got to get to 10 and above. And that's what you try to do over time, and that's auto escalation at all. John, you started out this whole discussion with the question about what can make the system better. And to me, the automatic enrollment, automatic escalation should be mandatory as part of the retirement system. If you do that, you'll greatly benefit the system. And I know many of the things they're talking about for further coverage, multi-employer plans at all, these become part of the system. And I do think if we could get those mandatory and get everyone using them and not just selected by company, it'd be a great benefit. The other point I'd like to make, I think sometimes we get lost that everyone that participates in a 401k is not a wealthy person. I mean, many companies have lower income workers, medium, high income workers, and you're picking up all those workers as long as they have a plan. And it's not demographically well generated who participates. And we see people at all income levels that have access participating. And one of the tests that 401k plan has to go for, a non-discrimination test, make sure that lower income contribute at similar levels to higher income. So I think that's been one of the benefits of the system, to really encourage lower income people to participate in these plans. It's up to the plan sponsor, it's to the plan sponsor's benefit to get all income levels participating.
All right, so I take your point that within a firm that offers a 401k, so a firm offers a 401k plan, it has high income and low income workers, auto enrollment is going to benefit the low income workers in those plans. There are a lot of firms that don't offer anything in the way of a 401k plan. They tend to have even lower incomes, be even smaller firms than the ones we've been talking about. Right? So those firms are not going to necessarily be providing access to that sample of the population. And we've already, I think there's kind of unanimous view coming out of the panel that what we need to have is some sort of mandate down to those firms in order to help expand access. All right, that makes sense. So I think I would be curious if Ed's picture seemed to have frozen on my computer, but I don't know if that, hopefully that's not the case. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about what's going on.
John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah, my video has froze, so I apologize for that.
Okay, we've still got the important part, so that's good. So your video without audio would have been less helpful. So Ed, what I'd actually like to do is I'd like to pivot for a minute and talk about what's happened in the retirement system during the last couple of months in response to COVID-19. We've obviously had a health pandemic. We've had very volatile financial markets, although they seem to be on the way to recovery. We've had record unemployment, right? So there's been a number of shocks that have all hit in the last couple of months. And I'm kind of curious about two things. The first thing I'm curious about, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, although I have some research on it, so it definitely interests me, is to what extent did people freak out in their retirement plans in February and March and sell low and basically say, well, I'm done with this? versus just kind of ride out the storm. And so Ed, I know you have statistics on plan participant behavior, and so I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, in some ways it's sort of counterintuitive when you think about where we were back in March and into April with a 30+% decline in the marketplace, and just in the market, and just the general uncertainty that people were feeling, both from a macroeconomic perspective and from a health perspective. But during that time, we only saw less than 2% of our participants, our client base, which is 9.6 million Americans. We only saw 2% that actually made some type of a change in their asset allocation, or sold securities and moved to money market or a cash preservation type product. So that surprised us a bit. Obviously, these are the message of treating this as sort of a long-term investment, and reinforcing that message along the way, I think, has probably helped. But given the uncertainty of the environment, we thought we would have seen a flight to quality, a flight to liquidity, and we just didn't see that.
That's interesting. And the research that I've been doing using data from a different record keeper, it was more like 8.5% of people made changes, but it was primarily older, higher net worth people making changes, and the lower income people that we would traditionally have maybe said are less financially savvy tended to just sit still. So in the other data I've seen, like 2% of people in target date funds and robo-advised accounts did nothing, right? And these are, I think, historically the people that we might have been most worried about making changes. So, but I'm curious, Ed, so among those people who were making changes, in your data, were they also the older people, maybe the people that Bob said had more equity exposure than they would have if they'd been in a target date fund? Do you have a sense?
Where we saw the preponderance of the changes were typically with people with higher balances, which would suggest that they're older, they've been working for a long period of time, they may be pre-retirees or even retirees for that matter. So in the case of individuals that had balances over $250,000, we saw much higher activity of exchanges and changes in portfolio than we did, for instance, for those that had balances under 25,000.
Okay, that's actually very much in line with what I saw. That's interesting. All right, so most people didn't do anything dramatic with respect to their asset allocation. What about pulling money out of the system? So Alicia, I know that you've looked at withdrawals in the past. I know that you've also looked at kind of the aggregate impact of the last financial crisis on retirement savings. What do we know about withdrawal behavior in general and with respect to financial crises?
So I just want to reinforce Ed's conclusion from this time around, because there wasn't that much asset reallocation during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. In terms of taking money out, it depends on whether you have your job or not. And the people who have their job don't tend to respond in any way. People who lose their job try not to use up that money, but eventually if they can't get reemployed, they have to turn to their 401k balances. Reinforcing no action this time around is that where you see most of the job loss is in the lower paid groups. And those are people who typically don't have 401k savings. So first of all, inertia is a wonderful thing sometimes, and this is one time. And so I'm not surprised there's not a lot of activity given inertia and the fact that these aren't the people losing their jobs.
Well, yeah, so inertia certainly can be good. I mean, the whole idea behind a lot of behavioral finance and economic insights is that if you help make a good decision for people, they're unlikely to reverse you, right? Yeah. When markets get volatile, they're unlikely to notice. They're busy doing other things. And if they've not started saving in the first place, inertia is a disaster, right? So that's
good point.
That's kind of how it plays out on both ends. So Ed, to what extent have we seen withdrawals, and to what extent have plan sponsors come to you asking about withdrawals in recent times?
So I would say since early April, we've been processing about 10,000 withdrawals per week. But we have not, again, that's on a base of 9.6 million customers. So I'd say we haven't seen a significant incremental need for funds versus what we would have seen over prior years. I mean, it's clearly up, but it's not up exponentially. And So there's no question that the economic downturn has led to an increase in the need for one to access cash. And this is in line with our experience, but certainly, you know, the magnitude is higher than what we've experienced in the past, but not, I think, what we would have anticipated, given the number of clients that have adopted the CARES provision. So it's really just a small percentage of the entire participant base that has made these types of withdrawals that are specific to COVID.
I guess that's a silver lining. It suggests people have access to cash, at least right now, that they need to kind of weather the storm here. That's good. One of the things that, Alicia, I know you've been tracking and that I'd seen some research on was ways that firms were responding. And I think the one that I remember reading about Duke University was that they had suspended their employer matches. And of course, because it's a university, it caught my attention, but I assume that this is a broader phenomenon. So what do we know about the extent to which employers have suspended employer matches right now?
So in the 2008-2009 recession, there was a lot of suspensions, and that was sort of a relatively new event, although there was some in the 2001 as well. Generally, these employers reinstated the match within a year or two. So this time around, we were ready. So we've created a list of all the companies that are suspending their matches, and we're following it really closely. And there are big names on it, Amtrak and Hilton, and of course Duke. But when I added up all the employees affected, it amounted to only about 1% of participants. And this time around, it's kind of one of the most benign things you can do if you're under financial pressure, when you see, you know, widespread furloughs and things like that. So I would say it's happening. It's a tool that some companies are using, but it has affecting a relatively small share of participants. And my sense is, if it follows the pattern of the earlier recession, then these matches will be reintroduced in a year or two.
So that's, I guess, relatively positive news as well when you say 1%. Good. All right, so I think we should transition back to, so one of the issues that keeps coming up that I want to focus on in just a minute is this idea that job loss is a huge problem when it comes to retirement savings. And of course, we have a system where retirement savings is tied to employers. So I think we should come to that in a minute. But before we get there, or maybe it's the same point, you know, are there broader lessons from the current financial crisis about the design of retirement savings that we want to touch on? And then we can talk about kind of access more broadly.
Can I start? The question is, what have we learned from this catastrophe? And I think I've learned or relearned how important Social Security is. So these are checks that go out every month to retirees and people with disabilities. This is a system that older workers can turn to for if they become unemployed and approach 62. It's not desirable to claim your benefits at 62, but it means that it's better than not being able to pay your rent. So the importance of Social Security is really driven home during this. And then the fact that the numbers that Ed alluded to, that so 40% of Americans really don't feel like they could cover a $400 bill, it's just shocking. And when you have a catastrophe like this, it shows how vulnerable, what a large swath of our population is.
You're on mute.
Yep, sorry. Bob, what is your take?
What's that?
What is your take on what's the big lessons we've learned from COVID-19?
Well, I think, you know, it's still to be played out. We're only close to 3 months into it, so it's a very short period of time. And, you know, it looks like people are starting to get back to work. So I think the lessons, you know, don't react immediately. And a lot of it is age-based. And, you know, if your time horizon's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, this is just a blip. If you're looking to retire at the end of the year, you're very, very concerned about what's going on in the market, which is why the closer you get to retirement, the more conservatively you should be invested. But I really think, you know, I need more time to pass and to see how the back end of this is before, you know, you really claim lessons learned. I think a lot of the participant behavior, you made one comment that these plans are tied to the employer. The plans are, but the account balances go with the employees. I think that's the great thing about workplace savings. And you can take it with you, you can leave it, you can roll it to an IRA. So that money is always there. And also, to what Alicia said earlier, I think Social Security, this is a great time, and I know it's going to be very, very difficult. We always talk about Social Security is so easy to fix, but it needs political courage, which is not necessarily in long supply, but I think we need to shore up Social Security because it's going to be tested in periods like this. And, you know, the so-called length of time that we have coverage, because, you know, it started out where you had 8 workers per retiree. I think we're down to 1 to 1 now. And that's just not enough coverage for a system that is so important to so many people.
Yeah, Social Security is obviously a bedrock for, I think one or all of you had said at some point that 1/3 of people essentially retire dependent entirely on Social Security, right? So for lower income workers in particular, this is a hugely important resource. Both of your books, I said I read both of your books, your book and Alicia's book, and I was disappointed at how much you agreed. I was hoping for more kind of fodder here. And
No, I'm disappointed how much we agree.
so I mean, the statistics are the same, the interpretations are similar. So maybe there's a difference in the sense in which Social Security should be expanded or not. There may be some difference of opinion there, but so what is kind of the collective wisdom about how to save Social Security if we're able to get the politicians kind of out of the way? And so Alicia, maybe we'll start with you, and then Bob, your take.
So it makes me nervous too that I agree with Bob so much and Ed. So the Social Security issue is not hard. We have promised benefits that cost more than the money that's coming in, and we're on a annual basis. We're actually running short, but we have a trust fund that was created in 1983, and we're using money from that trust fund to bridge this gap between promised benefits and revenues. The money from that trust fund runs out in the early 2030s. And then the government will have to reduce benefits by 25% if something's not done, because the program's not allowed to pay benefits if the money is not there. And so no one wants that. Everyone wants to eliminate that shortfall. And the question is, do you do it by cutting benefits and keeping our current payroll taxes? Or do you keep our current benefits and get more revenues, or some compromise in between? And I know compromise sounds so fair. You do half on one side and half on another side, but I don't think that is the right answer this time around. I really think that we should not cut Social Security benefits. And I know there's no manna from heaven. And so that means we have to put revenues into the program. And then there are parts of the program that probably should be enhanced a little. But just my strong message is don't cut Social Security benefits. Do it on the financing side. So I think if we are trying to get some disagreement among us, that's probably the area that you can get some disagreement. But in terms of all this other stuff, mandate, employer mandate, and auto enroll people, make 401k plans auto all the way. I think we all agree on that. I think the only way we can get into any fisticuffs here is how you want to solve the Social Security program.
Okay, well, you just did a very nice job of highlighting the things you agree about and also highlighting the area where I can get you guys to fight. So that's a nice segue. So Bob, what
Yes.
cutting benefits or not?
No, I don't know if anyone has talked about cutting benefits. It's how do you pay for them? I mean, you could say cutting benefits is raising the retirement age, which has been gradual. When Social Security came in the 40s, I believe, 30s, 40s, you know, Social Security kicked in at 65. The average life expectancy was 62. So it wasn't a big actuarial bet. And now the average life expectancy is in the 80 plus. So, but we still have moved the retirement age. You know, it could be 62, but 65, 67. And I just think we need to take a harder look at that. Now, you could say that's cutting into benefits. To me, it's just bringing Social Security up to where we are in time. The other thing you can do is increase the payroll tax. There's a cap at a certain level where Medicare goes to all your earned income. Social Security cuts off at a level. You can increase revenue to make the system more solid. You can do needs-based because not everyone needs Social Security like a majority of the population. So there's many ways to do it. And back to the point I think that was originally made, what we're talking about is a math problem here. And again, I personally have not heard people say, let's cut the benefits. I mean, they're going to be cut automatically unless we don't do anything on the revenue side. But it's just a math problem that can be fixed. It just takes, as I mentioned earlier, political courage.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here real quick, John, a couple of comments. I agree it's a math problem. The challenge is getting the political will to make something happen. And until Congress is backed up to the wall and they realize they have to do something, eventually they will, then it's math. So basically you raise the cap, you raise the rate. Worst case scenario, you could institute means testing at some point. It's probably one of the easier problems to solve, quite honestly, and it will be solved. You know, a lot of it depends on how the Social Security Trust is doing, and if it has a good year, then Congress doesn't feel compelled to necessarily step in and take action. I just wanted to make one comment back on the, you know, what have we learned from COVID? I think one of the things that we've learned is people need to save. You know, we're a consumption society, and I recognize there are some people today that are living hand to mouth and are hard pressed to find the ability to save anything. But there are lots of Americans that can save. They can save $20, $30, $40, $50 a week. And we need to do that because you need to prepare for events like the one we're experiencing. And I think many Americans were ill prepared based on the statistics that we've seen.
So thank you. I actually saw one mildly hopeful update, which is that it's no longer 40% of Americans who can't come up with $400. It's 39% of Americans. So we had a 1 percentage point improvement there, which, you know, some news article made it sound like it was a pretty big news. I'm not sure that really counts. All right, so excellent, very good. I think in the 5 minutes we have left before we turn it over to Q&A, there's one area we haven't really begun to touch on, at least not directly, which is decumulation, which is this: how do you manage your assets in retirement? And as an academic, it's fun to write papers about accumulating assets, and it's less fun because it's much harder to write papers about decumulating assets. And so the industry has really evolved in the direction of helping people accumulate, and then, at least in some cases, you're on your own. So what is the natural evolution to help people in the decumulation phase? Certainly if you're in Social Security, that's helpful, but in the 401k space, what's the next step for helping people with decumulation?
Well, look, I think the greatest risk that someone faces is outliving their income in retirement. And that's the challenge. So the safe harbor that was provided for sponsors that now give them some protection from offering insurance-based products like annuities and guaranteed income type solutions, I think will begin to sort of open the floodgates between insurance companies and asset management firms. There's a lot of great work being done now to address the decumulation challenge and opportunity. You've got 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day. The focus of the industry has been primarily on accumulation, but now from a demographic standpoint, it's important that we focus on income. And it's interesting, polls that we've done and surveys that we've done with our clients, over 50% of our participants have expressed interest in some type of a guaranteed solution. They may not want to take their entire balance and put it into a guaranteed solution, but if you could guarantee them 4 or 5%, which is really hard to do in this environment, but if you could guarantee them that's backed by insurance companies, some form of a guarantee, and then ultimately that guarantee converts to an income type vehicle, and you combine that with Social Security and other private savings, I think we go a long way to addressing it. So I'm pretty pleased with what I'm seeing. Bob's company, Putnam's, doing some great work in this space. We have an insurance charter, but we work with other insurance companies. So I think you're going to see insurance companies, asset managers coming together with creative products, some of which are insurance-based that have these guarantees, others non-insurance based. And but the challenge that we're all facing is this low interest rate environment. And clearly we're going to be in this environment for a long time. So that's the challenge.
All right, thank you. Alicia, what would you like to add?
So, we too have been focusing on decumulation. There are two risks. One, that you're going to outlive your resources, or that you're going to be too cautious. I really worry that people who have 401k plans are going to be reluctant to spend the money that they've accumulated over time and deprive themselves of necessities. Also, if you have this money in retirement, you have to think about investing it, which is really a complicated thing to do. So I think lifetime income is really important. The idea that we've been sort of playing with and comparing to alternatives is using your own 401k balances, or a portion of them, to support yourself so that you can defer claiming Social Security. Because if you can put off claiming Social Security from 62 to 70, the amount that you're going to get will be 76% higher. So that means you have more lifetime income, and it's a particularly wonderful type of lifetime income since it's adjusted for inflation. So if you could take half of your 401k balances, use that to approximate your Social Security benefit until you claim, and then get this higher Social Security benefit, it's equivalent to buying an annuity, but it's better income because it's inflation adjusted, and it's cheaper. There are no fees involved. And so we'd really like to see that as almost a default in 401k plans, that the first thing you do with your money is postpone claiming.
Makes sense to me. Okay, Bob, what is Putnam doing in this space, and how does it relate to?
Well, we're working at tying in an insurance type product into a target date fund. So it automatically, once you do retire, it sets up a lifetime income stream for you. And that's something we're working very, very hard on, working with various insurance companies that's out there. I would say that when, and Ed touched upon it earlier, the accumulation phase, we know it works. And, we're probably in the 8th inning there, once you get the coverage model expanded. For retirement income, we're probably in the 2nd inning. I hate to use a baseball analogy since we're not playing, but we're probably in the 2nd inning. So there's huge opportunity for innovation. I think you're going to see more of it. One thing that we've discussed a lot is the so-called reverse mortgages, because most Americans, the greatest asset they have is their home, and they have a lot of equity in it. And if we can find a way for people to tap into that equity, it comes to them really tax-free, and it sets up an income stream where they don't have to necessarily go to 401k. I think Social Security to 70 is the right choice, but there are different things like that that I think you're going to see a lot more of that really start addressing this retirement income stream, which is extremely, extremely important.
Yeah, the key thing, John, that we haven't talked about that I think is critical to this conversation in particular is helping people think through how to make these decisions. You know, so from a decumulation standpoint, what's the most tax efficient way to draw down my money? And that's something that we've seen change dramatically, particularly over the last 3 to 4 months. Our request for one-on-one consultations are up 150%. So people are looking for reassurance, they're looking for guidance, they're looking for advice. You know, Elisa talked about claiming strategies. Yeah, in most cases, it does make sense to defer claiming Social Security to your 70. But if you're 61 and you have lung cancer stage 4, you probably don't want to do that. So this is where I think, you know, I would encourage people to work with an advisor. You need to have that plan, put that plan together so that when you're executing that drawdown strategy that you referenced, the whole decumulation strategy, you need to think about it in the context of what's the most efficient and proper way to draw down those assets. For some people, it's simple because they might only have one account, they might have one vehicle, but for others, they're going to need support and help in how to do that. There's over 200 ways to claim Social Security, so somebody needs to help Americans think through the right sequence.
That was very good. Thank you. We've now passed.
Can I just agree with Bob one more time? So I'm just sort of like a gusher, like a fan, right? Because Bob brought up the house. I love the house as a source of retirement support. I'm sort of a little bit of a lapsed reverse mortgage person, but we've been playing with proposals to expand property tax deferral in Massachusetts. And so these would be programs where you would just be able to check a box and say, I don't want to pay my property taxes because I'm 65 and over. When you move or sell, then you pay back the tax with interest. And that seems like maybe a cheaper, easier way of also tapping home equity. But I just want to gush over the likeness of our thinking.
If you can get Charlie Baker to sign off on that one, Elisa, I'll give you
I've tried, but I think he's a little preoccupied right now. I think this is the optimal time.
State and local governments are not going to be anything for revenue reduction right now.
No, but Bob, that's a self-financing program on a household basis.
Yeah, but municipalities in Massachusetts especially live off of property tax.
Right. So there is a cash flow issue, and you do need either private-public partnership or the state. And before we decided to have a pandemic, it seemed like a plausible way of going.
I agree.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, very good. So I think it's now time to transition to the Q&A. I've just been given several pages of questions, and I'm going to do my best to kind of get through them. One of the things that I wanted to touch on first, though, is these state-sponsored retirement plans that have come up. So Oregon Saves is the one I'm the most familiar with. I was at Oregon before I came to Boston College. I'm doing research on Oregon Saves. And the way the plan is structured is that it extends coverage to firms that don't have 401k plans. It's an auto-enrolled Roth IRA, meaning after-tax IRA. The account follows the person. And what we see in the data, now these data are hard to analyze, in part because it's just noisy administrative data other people worked out. But I think the lesson that comes out of those data, to me, the first one is a lot of people say they can't afford to save. So while automatic enrollment has been very successful in other settings, it does seem like it is getting much lower increases in savings within Oregon's lower income employers that are subject to the plan. And so this gets back to this earlier question about if you can only save for one thing, what should you save for? And the way Oregon Saves is structured is that the first $1,000 goes into a money market account, and then everything after that goes into a target date fund. And so I think it was designed that way for tax and other reasons, but they managed to create both a liquid savings account and a retirement savings account. And the initial data I've seen suggests most people have left their money in over the last couple of months. Now, a lot of people don't put any money in, but conditional on putting money in, a lot of people are leaving their money in. So I thought those were some interesting kind of statistics. But really people are asking things like, if I can only do one, which should I do? So our answer before was both, but it seems like, then there's the third wrinkle is, I'm saving for college. Should I pay down my college loans or should I put money into a 401k plan? So I don't know if people want to talk a little bit more broadly about debt management for particularly younger workers.
Well, first of all, I think that the state plans emerged in part because there was a gap around the universal coverage issue. And now that I think that there's momentum with a flexible solution that would cover all businesses, all small businesses, I have a strong preference to a universal solution versus a state by state. I also think that in general, the states, they don't manage these programs particularly well anyway. And depending on the state, you haven't really seen much in the way of real adoption. I think Oregon has probably gotten off to a better start than some of the other states, but I don't see them as sustainable vehicles, particularly when we're going to have a universal solution. And then I think to your point on the asset liability piece, you do need to look at both, and it kind of goes back to the point that you were making around helping people make choices and understanding the trade-offs in those decisions. So, for example, we have a partnership with a company called Common Bond, where with respect to those that have student loan debt, we actually provide an advisory solution to them, helping them through that. And if refinancing makes sense, we can do that. We can also help them through the sequencing around, should they be paying off the student loan first before contributing to 401k. But those are the kinds of conversations, discussions that need to take place so everyone understands what those trade-offs are.
So can I respond, John? John?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, you went to.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
I just a couple of things. I have to. I agree with you, John. Here, I think these state experiments are really exciting and wonderful. And of course, nobody wants 50 different programs, but there was a vacuum, and the states took some leadership, and I think it's really to their credit. I think this idea that they're not well run is really not fair. I think they are quite well run. They're learning a lot. It's harder to roll these things out than people have thought. But I'm kind of impressed by the level of participation. I never expected high levels of saving. And I think we're going to learn a lot from these state experiments that then can be incorporated into making a national program work effectively. So I think that that is to the good. I think this whole issue of student debt is huge, and we really haven't talked about it. We were looking at millennials the other day, and they're just so far behind at this sort of 30 to 35 age range than previous cohorts, because they start out with such an immense burden. It just makes it hard to get their balance sheet in order to hit life's hurdles in terms of marriage and buying a house and all that kind of stuff. So I think student debt, I was hoping that somebody would solve it as long as we were spending trillions. I thought that maybe somebody could have solved this student debt problem during this pandemic.
Yeah, student debt is definitely not going away.
No.
Employee of an institute of higher education that charges tuition, I apologize in advance to any of my students who feel like they don't get full value out of my classes. I try hard. Okay, so Bob, here's a question for you, and it's a little bit on the snarky side, but I'm interested in how you respond. So you had said there are definitely people we want in the system. Or those are definitely people we want in the system, referring to I think expanding the set of coverage. And so this person wondered, are there groups that we don't want in the system? Now, I can guess what your answer is going to be, but I thought in the interest of having a snarky question, I would ask that one.
I don't think it's snarky. I think you want everyone in the system. But yeah. I think a point that was mentioned earlier, there's going to be some people that just can't afford it. I mean, that's a fact. And again, I think you want everyone in that can participate, even if they're saving a minimal amount. And I think that's one of the great things, you know, when I look at workplace savings, there was never this group can't participate or this group can, or the higher paid participate and lower paid don't. That hasn't been the way the system works. So I'm for total participation, but I think it's up to each individual to determine whether they can participate and at what level.
I think with this, with the economy evolving the way it has, John, where it's more of a contractor gig economy, free agent type economy, sometimes those individuals get lost. And so, you know, whether it's through IRAs or whether it's enrolling in a program with the company that they're working for, that's one of the areas that we've been particularly focused on, is that contract worker and the gig economy. I think those that struggle with saving and participating in these programs, many of those individuals are going to be covered by Social Security. In fact, all of them will be covered by Social Security, and most of them will, in fact, replace 100% of their pre-retirement income.
No. Social Security doesn't replace 100%. And also, as we increase the retirement age from 65 to 67, the lower income people who retired at 62 get just increasing actuarial reductions. And so they're not replacing, there's no replacement of 100%. So it's not happening.
Well, it's a question of whether people are retiring at 62. Most of the people that struggle with savings are the ones that continue to work up until their death, frankly.
A lot of low-income people claim benefits at 62.
Yes, and in the Oregon Saves data I've seen, when we ask people why they don't participate, a popular answer is, I will never be able to retire, or I don't anticipate retiring. I remember one person writing, I will die on my job, right, or at my work. And so not a
I think that's one of the debate points around the retirement age in Social Security, because jobs are different. If you have a job which is very physically exertive, maybe you should retire at a younger age, or, you know, if it's the opposite, maybe it should be at a later age. And that's why I think one of the debate points around what's the right retirement age, and maybe there needs to be some work done on that about what type of job do you have and what's the right retirement age.
I think it's interesting to think about different workers facing different expected retirement ages. It does seem like the sort of thing that may be politically challenging. I mean, one of the beautiful things about Social Security is that it's progressive, and most people don't know it's progressive, which means most people are in favor of it. As soon as you start means testing it or changing the parameters, you do run the risk of eroding, at least on the margin, some of the support for the program. I mean, whether someone would say, is it fair that someone with a different job can retire before me? I mean, maybe in some sense it is, maybe it isn't, but there may be a reaction politically one way or the other, which I think is interesting. So I have a completely unrelated question from someone, but I think is also interesting, which is effectively what do we think of these apps that are encouraging millennials to day trade? And, you know, yes, you can save some money, but also maybe, you know, here's a stock you should buy today or sell tomorrow. Do we think the net effect of kind of the current millennials being exposed to finance through apps is helpful, harmful? We don't really know.
I think people do business with the way they want to do business, and you're going to see the younger generation become very, very attuned to dealing with things over the computer. And I think it's just a part of the time. And, you know, banking now, how many people go into the bank, and how many people write checks, and, you know, things change. So that doesn't bother me at all. Day trading was big back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
probably not a successful trading strategy for most. Fair enough.
Depends upon the market.
Yeah, I guess that's right. So there is something we touched upon before and not really come back to is this low interest rate environment. So we've had low interest rates for a long time. Following the kind of recent shocks, it seems like we're in for low rates for even longer. Low rates have been devastating for state and local pension plans because it's made them very difficult for them to actually earn the returns that they need to pay the benefits that they say they're going to pay. So it's created underfunding problems there. But for everyone else, it's also created the challenge of how do you accumulate the assets you need to retire. And so I know the easy answer when I'm teaching a basic finance class is, well, if the expected rate of return goes down, you're gonna have to save more to get to the same place. That's not a very satisfying answer for most people. So the question I got is, what is the advice on asset allocation that you would give people in a low interest rate environment versus a high interest rate environment? Does your recommendation change in how people should invest?
Well, I think there are other factors that come into play, John. For instance, one's time horizon, one's risk tolerances. But in general, I think if you're younger, you should have a higher allocation towards equities than you would fixed income. I think for older Americans who are struggling with the income gap issue that you talked about, this low interest rate environment is forcing them to take more risk than they otherwise would. Buying more individual securities, high yielding stocks, buying mutual funds perhaps that are more exposed to equities in order to try to generate that yield that they need to live off of. So I think this is the new normal for a while. In fact, we're going to hear from the Fed governor this afternoon, the chairman of the Fed this afternoon, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about the interest rate horizon. So, but I think asset allocation is important. I think getting with a professional and understanding what that right balance is between stocks, equities, fixed income, and cash instruments is really important. But you do need to take into consideration your investment horizon and the willingness and the appetite to take risk.
So thank you. I was just reminded that not everyone knows what fixed income means. So fixed income is investing in bonds, some safer assets. Equity stocks typically are synonymous.
John, can I just raise a question? Because Ed keeps saying that, you need an advisor. I think my view is just different, that I think the systems should be easy and automatic, and that the average person shouldn't need an advisor, that we kind of put them in good places, that in terms of having a fully automated 401k plan, you are put in a target date fund and your default contribution rate auto escalates, and then we need to get some automatic way that you get more lifetime income out of 401ks than we do now, but it needs to happen automatically. I think American families are hugely busy and stressed, and the idea that they're going to sit down and talk about their finances is not going to happen. So I think the basic infrastructure's got to lead people to the right place.
Well, I think that's a fair point. When I think of advice, I think about it in a myriad of ways. First of all, if you look at people that turn their assets over to professional management through services like managed accounts, I mean, I can show you statistics that are very compelling. Those individuals that are in managed accounts where the manager is effectively taking the discretion, they save more, they're less emotional, and they're more on track to replace their income in retirement than those that don't. I can also show you very powerful statistics in terms of the value of the advisor. And let me just say, I'm not in the advisory business. I mean, I'm not Morgan Stanley, I'm not wealth management. I'm just purely looking at the data. And people who interface or interact with an advisor, again, whether it's an advice-based product, and that could be a target date fund, it could be a managed account, or whether it's working with a human being, they do far better. The challenge is, can we get advisors, to the extent people want that human interaction, can we get them to work with small balance customers? And typically you can't. And that's where, to your point, Lisa, I think having a product or a solution which basically does it for them, and that's what managed accounts does, and that's what target dates do to a large degree, is the solution for those individuals. So So I would say I agree with you on that front, but I also see the value of the advisor as well, the human being, for the right person. Some people have, they might have 50, 70, $100,000 of discretionary assets, and they might have 2 or 3 goals that they're working towards: retirement, college savings, emergency fund. Having the ability to interface with somebody and talk through those things is something that I think can be very valuable.
So,
Yeah, John, to a point you made earlier about millennials, I think for them to use the tools that they have available to them is fine, if that's what they want to use. But so many of them want to talk to an individual at some point. And I think what's been interesting is the so-called robo space or automated type tools are starting to provide people access to talk to individuals. And I think that what's happened through the first quarter of this year, and you look at the major providers of advice or robo, et cetera, they're at all-time high levels, because in periods of uncertainty, people want to talk to someone. They want to confirm that they're in the right direction or sitting in the right place. So I think people are going to choose to do business with people on the consumer side, not how we want to deal with them, but how they want to deal with us.
Just building off of Bob's point, Schwab had their best quarter of new account openings, I think, in the history of the company in terms of the sheer volume of accounts. And those are not coming from wealthy people. Fidelity, in the middle of the pandemic, announced that they were hiring 2,000 additional client-facing representatives to handle the volume of inquiries where people are looking for reassurance and advice. That wasn't 2,000 people in their high net worth area. That was 2,000 people that are interfacing with normal, average Americans with average balances. So, and to Bob's point, I think what you are seeing in the robo space, even if you look at these startup robos like the Betterments, the Wealthfronts, the Wealthsimples, they've all now morphed to these hybrid models now. It started off that it was 100% digital, all automated, you can't talk to a human being. And they realized that's not a sustainable business model, and that's not addressing customer needs. So now they've incorporated the human capital component into it.
So this idea of advice is one that's of interest to me. And in fact, last year we had a panel talking about, or maybe it was 2 years ago, we had a panel talking about provision of financial advice. The challenge that came up then, and that is, I think, coming up right now, is human advice is expensive. Robo advice is cheap. And so providing robo advice to whomever you can provide robo advice to is kind of the better model. The challenge, of course, is when people say, the market's freaking out, I want to talk to a person, and then it becomes more expensive. And then someone ultimately has to pay for the cost of those people interacting with the client. And so, I think that's just a model we're trying to sort out. Like, what is the right blend of robo versus human contact, and how does that vary across demographic groups, or at least age groups and asset levels? I think we'll probably figure that out. The thing that happened in the UK that I find so interesting is that they tried to improve the quality of advice by banning commissions, and they basically shut down their market, or cut in half their market for financial advice. And so they managed to improve the quality, but they really then forced the advice up market, and robo advice is maybe coming in to fill that void. I think it'll be really interesting to see how advice evolves in the US. I have research with Dave Richardson at TIAA Institute where we find that people in target date funds are actually much less likely to use any of the advice tools than similar people without the target date funds. And so we had thought maybe there's some sort of substitution, but it may be in volatile markets. Everyone comes out and wants to talk to a person, right? So it may just be that that's a reality.
Well, and even somebody in a target date fund, they're still paying 100 basis points or 80 basis points. I mean, it's not as if, and they're getting, in effect, they're getting advice from that. Right. So if you work with an advisor, you might pay $250 a year that's being debited from your account on a $25,000 balance. I don't know. Is it worth $15, $18, $20 a month to get access to a human being that has expertise? I think, like every industry, the cost of advice both in terms of the delivery aspect of it as well as what consumers pay, it's come down materially. I mean, it's a very competitive market. So I think the consumer can make that judgment. Am I getting the value for what I'm paying? Increasingly, it seems like they've said yes to that question.
Okay, so I was just told that we have 5 minutes left, although at this point it's actually only 4 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to end with just kind of a crystal ball type question so people can put as positive a spin on all of this as they like, end on a positive note during these difficult times. So what I'm interested in asking each of you is, looking forward over the next 10 years, what is the biggest change you expect to see made in the U.S. retirement space? Looking back 10 years from now, we look back like, yes, you were right. I'm curious, like, what it is you think is going to be the biggest change that's going to be made over the next 10 years. And we'll start with Alicia.
So I'm convinced, like Ed and Bob, that we're going to fix the coverage gap and do it on a national basis, which will be huge. And also we're going to be forced to address Social Security. So that's a lot of retirement stuff happening in the next 10 years.
Very good. All right, Ed, what do you think?
Well, obviously I agree with Lisa. I think that would be significant. And I think 2021 could very much be the year. Post-election, I think this could be the year where you'll see true retirement legislation that might rival what we saw in 2006 with the PPA, because you do have a lot of bipartisan support. There's a lot of energy behind this. The one thing I would say is I think that this idea of portability and people being able to move their monies from one provider to another as they move their jobs. We know that the average 25-year-old today is going to work for 8, 10, 12 different companies during his or her career. And so I think what you could see is, for lack of a better word, kind of the deconstruction, if you will, of the institutional aspect of the 401k defined contribution system, where it's the Bob Reynolds account, it's the Ed Murphy account, the Elisa Manel account. I might work for Lockheed Martin, but it's really my own account. And I'm not, there isn't this governance model that oversees it and manages it at the corporate level. It wouldn't surprise me if we evolve to that point.
All right, thank you. And so Bob, the last words go to you.
Yeah, I don't have a lot different. I think, having spent a lot of time in Washington, the bipartisan interest in retirement is huge. So I do think this coverage model is going to get solved. I think the way the system works is going to get much easier for a lot of people. And I just think everyone realizes that this touches everyone. And it's not going to be a partisan issue. It's going to be a bipartisan issue. And I think you're going to see a lot of people behind reform and making the system better for everyone.
Well, that was very optimistic. I'm excited. I'm excited to see things get better. Take a strong foundation and make it stronger. All right. Well, so at this point, I'd like to thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion about issues related to retirement savings. Thank you for making my job easy, reminding me when I was muted versus not muted. That was particularly helpful. And so now I think it's my job to turn things back over to Dean Boynton to say a couple of parting comments. And I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful day and thank you so much for your participation, both panelists and audience members. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Great, John.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. And thank you, John, for your moderation of this terrific panel. I'm just sure everybody enjoyed it. John, I'll see you around Fulton Hall. For everybody out there, today's recording of this webinar is available. Keep that in mind. You can see it yourself again or share it with others. The recording is on the website bc.edu/CSOM, CSOM. Thank you all for joining us today. And remember, we have another great webinar this Friday. Same time, same place on financial global markets. In the meantime, be well and be safe. Take care.